So many people felt like that what we were doing is we were just going to assess schools that had dwindling enrollment, and we were going to close their schools because that's what they had dealt with. And we really went through a lot of planning, and we went through a very complicated process with Project Schoolhouse. And as we were starting into Project Schoolhouse, I knew that we had to have some kind of assistance to help us through it because we were busy managing at the time the state's largest school district. So we didn't have time to throw all of the energy and leadership into Schoolhouse that it needed. We had an excellent relationship with the Kaiser Family Foundation, and I spoke to them and said, I'm going to need some help with Schoolhouse. Well, not only gave me help, but they provided me with the person who led, with the person who was in charge of Project Schoolhouse. A lot of people don't know that, although it did make it into the media that we were using an outside consultant because people wanted to know, were we utilizing public dollars on this schoolhouse with the enormous amount of time, expense, and energy that it took to do it. But they recommended to me Jim McCarthy. Jim, I guess, is an attorney by trade, has a law degree from Michigan. I don't know that he ever really practiced much law. I think he became much more interested in the field of change and change management. Not only did they pay for Jim to lead, to be the lead person with Project Schoolhouse, but they agreed that we could move him into our offices. So during the entire time of Project Schoolhouse at Tulsa Public Schools, arguably one of the highest profile initiatives in the history of the state of Oklahoma, in that we were on the news every single night with what we were doing with Schoolhouse. And Jim McCarthy was office there. I saw him every single day. And during the time I was still at TPS, I came to realize the importance that Project Schoolhouse would have in the classroom. As you will find out, one of the primary emphasis that we have at OU is preparing you to be leaders. There's a real world out there, and you live and you work in it every single day. And while you will study research and while you will study theory, all of which is important, you have to know how to navigate. You have to know what it takes if you're going to be successful to be the high school principal at Bixby High School, or you're going to work in IT. And I think I might have figured out who you are because you're wearing an East Central shirt. Were you at Will Rogers?
I worked with your son.
Oh yeah, my son. You're in a good place because my son really liked you a lot. But you know that.
Yeah, he was good.
We all know, and we have great relationships with people, and I just now realize that that's who you are. Will Rogers certainly was a reciprocal. Now he's at East Central now. Was certainly a recipient of huge changes that came out of Schoolhouse. So the brains behind Project Schoolhouse really was Jim McCarthy. And he came back just because I felt it'd be interesting and to have utility for my students. But then I began thinking about how we have to lead through change. And that's why you had the second assignment that you have is how to lead through change. So really this has evolved into, this is the perfect time to put Jim McCarthy in front of you. I will tell you this, if you don't find this riveting and interesting and enjoyable, you'll be the first people, and he's spoken to a lot of classes, you'll be the first ones who don't find it that way. So I say with great confidence that you're going to enjoy this discussion led by Jim McCarthy. And we actually have elongated his presentation. We tried doing it in the confines of an hour, and it worked very well. So we have now moved into a couple of hours, the discussion led by Jim, but I'm here to kind of chime in, or if he calls on me, then he will do that. So my really, really dear friend, as not only somebody you like, but the relationship that was forged under fire.
Yes, sir.
And hardened under fire. Jim McCarthy is here to talk with you today. And then after his presentation, then we'll go through our normal introductions. So, Jim, we'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ballard. This is the only reason I really do this, is I love this introduction. I am an attorney by trade, and that means that, like all attorneys, I'm pretty much in love with the sound of my voice. And your job is to make sure that there are other voices that chime in. Otherwise, I'll be perfectly happy at the end of all this, because I will have listened to myself talk.
Is that okay? I hate to interrupt, but I want to get the lighting just right where you can take notes, but you can see this better. Okay, go ahead, Jim.
Okay. Just a little bit of background. I did not practice law long. Was very quickly moved into a management position at Citgo Petroleum Corporation when it was headquartered here, and worked in a variety of positions there, ending up as the Vice President of Government and Public Affairs. But throughout my career, I was given the opportunity to work through major changes in the corporation, changes in ownership, changes in structure, changes in corporate direction, and I was the beneficiary of that learning and understanding, and it's my pleasure to try and share as much of that with you as possible. So I'm going to go through this. I don't know if I can live up to that introduction, but I'm going to give it my best shot. I always try to do my best work for Dr. Ballard, because he pretty much expects you to do your best work. He does let you know if it doesn't happen.
That applies to the classroom as well.
Okay. Let's see, how do I get what happened? There. All right. So this was the situation that we found ourselves in. Not an unusual situation, but a very personal situation for Tulsa. Did a little bit of history work and found out that in 1952 we had 41,000 students and 56 buildings. In 68 we had 80,000 students, just about twice the number, in just about twice the number of buildings. And unfortunately in 2010 we once again had 41,000 students, and we still had 90 out of those 100 buildings. It's very expensive to operate the facilities with fewer and fewer students. All of the costs remain the same. You still have heating the whole building, air conditioning the whole building, janitorial for the whole building, maintenance of the roof, maintenance of the exterior. It's a very expensive proposition. At the same time, the state of Oklahoma began, or was continuing at that point, I guess, a squeeze down on support, financial support for the public education system. So what did we have? We had schools that were so under-enrolled that they were inefficient, both academically and financially. As you well understand, the number of students drives the number of teachers that you have to teach. And as we had fewer and fewer teachers, we found ourselves in a situation where we had, even in some schools, more than one grade in the same classroom. And that's obviously not the best situation. I will say that when I first was brought in on this, it wasn't known as Project Schoolhouse. It was called the Project School Closure. And I got to tell you, from a public relations standpoint, this is a hard enough job as it is. And I say what you like. I think having a little more friendly moniker for the project helped us out a little bit. At least we got our foot in the door, and people were willing to listen to us. What we tried to do, and I think what is the hallmark of any good change management, is try to increase either your efficiency and or your effectiveness. And if you can hit either of those targets, then it's really, the work you've done is worth the effort. At the same time, TPS had just gone through a very strenuous rethink about what its mission was and its vision. The decision was to move from, I think, the district of choice was the old vision.
Absolutely.
And move to excellence and high expectations with a commitment for all, which is a much stronger and much more direct and I think much more high-minded and on-point vision statement.
I might just speak to that, and you will find that while Jim is leading the discussion, I will chime in as he goes through his presentation. Our thinking at the time was district of choice implied that there was something better over the horizon. There was something better on the other side of town. There was something better in another, neighborhood. And we were very deliberate about excellence and high expectations with commitment to all. We wanted to get away from the choice. We had people running all over the place, believing that where they had to be was someplace other than a neighborhood school. We believe in choice. We believe in magnet schools, and we certainly have some. Chris, you're fine. You're not in my way at all.
Okay.
Go right ahead. But we were trying to make a very deliberate statement whenever we said a commitment to all high expectations and excellence, and we had just made that change.
And our thought process was, rather than lop on Project Schoolhouse as in addition, try to use the momentum that had been generated by the change in the vision and the mission statement and say, Project Schoolhouse is really a tool. It's a mechanism to help move towards this new vision statement where we could have consistent quality schools throughout and operate in a more equitable and most cost-effective manner. These are the kind of slides that I show typically when I start a change management project. Make sure that people understand the lay of the land. It is major project management. There are an inconceivable number of moving parts. There are consequences that are primary, secondary, tertiary, all of which have to be considered. And it typically requires a shift in the culture, a shift in the thinking. And that's why we wanted to use the momentum of the change of the vision statement. Try to keep people focused on forward thinking, new thinking. There is a human tendency in any change to harken back to, well, in the good old days, we used to be able to do this. Or back in the 50s, this always worked. And change management is always about not repeating what's happened in the past, but creating a new future. And Dr. Ballard, I'm happy to send this presentation to you, and you can distribute to the class. So
Right.
You don't have to try to capture all this. You'll get it all. There are no bad ideas. The last thing you want to do is squelch new think. Sometimes there's a peculiar idea that will be thrown out, but it has its roots in something, and it can really spark some good thinking.
I think that's such a good point that Jim was making there, because back when we were going through Schoolhouse, I would continually hear, well, Dr. Ballard has a list of schools, he knows what he's going to do. He carries it in his pocket, and Jim chuckles, but he with that line. He has a list. He knows what he's going to do. Couldn't have been further from the truth. And I think what Jim said and how he said it is just so true, and I think it drives not only leading through change, but it drives leadership, and that is just be open to other thoughts. Just be open to it, because a lot of our really good thoughts really came from kind of out of the blue sources, and we were like, well, what about that? And in fact, we were so fluid and we were so flexible that finally people came to believe that we really didn't have our minds already made up. We only had our mind made up about one thing, Jim knows. And that was that we were going to be open, and we were going to be creative, and we were going to think about what was going to be best for Tulsa.
Right. And the last 2 points are trying to underscore the fact that change management is work. It's hard work. Changing people's minds, coming up with a better mousetrap, a better idea is hard work. And it's slow and it's steady, and you can't lose faith anywhere along the line. So, what are the building blocks for this? Change management inevitably becomes an emotional issue. If you're there's a perception someone's trying to take something away that I have, that makes me uncomfortable. Someone's trying to make me do something I don't know how to do, that makes me uncomfortable. All of these stimulate the emotional side of the brain. So change management best strategy is to keep leaning towards the rational. What does the data say? What is black and white? What is the number? What is the word? Because those things don't raise that emotion in people. They're easy to see, they're well understood, and they're very difficult to just say, well, I don't believe that. As we came up with 10 measurement criteria, we were going to measure every school by the same yardstick. We made it very clear we were going to measure every school. There were no sacred cows. And we made it very clear we were going to make all the data public. And that's, once you try to hide some piece of change management, you lose all your credibility. And as hard as it is to look, and I'm going to show you some data that we put out there in public that is very ugly and did not reflect well on TPS as a whole, certain schools in particular, and probably right down into the certain classrooms. But we decided we were going to make it all public, warts and all, and then there'd be no question about it. The other thing I've done a lot of media work. The media too loves to fan the flames with the emotional side. Sells a lot more ad space, whether it's on TV or in print, if anybody reads print anymore. And so constantly, if it becomes a public matter, constantly courting the press, feeding them the factual side, making sure that they come back to the factual side is very important. At the same time, you do have to just react to, let people vent, I guess is the easiest way to put it. There are emotions built up in there, you've got to let them out, and you've got to be able to listen to them. Lord knows we listen to plenty of venting, and you've got to be able to say, okay, I hear you, I understand what you're saying, now let's get back to the facts, let's get back to the numbers, let's get back to the words.
I have to make this point right here, because this business of if you get punched, punch back 10 times harder, that don't work. That does not work in the public sector, not when you're this close to the people, not when you're in public hearings and you are this close to the people, and you have the opportunity to interact with them and to look at them and to feel them and to sense what emotion is about. It may work if you're somewhere and I retire, but that's not what leadership is about. And this, I really, when I saw this, I said to myself, this is the brilliance of what Jim McCarthy did for us. And that is that he boiled things down to a very understandable level. And I'm going to tell you right now that if you want to work in the public eye, you want to work with the public, then you need to accept that this is going to happen. You need to accept that if you're going to be the superintendent in Wagner or at Riverside, that you're going to deal with people. You are. And they're going to be as close as I am to you right now. And if you don't have the capacity to acknowledge emotions of folks, to allow venting, and to still remain in charge, and to know, and for people to sense, well, this is somebody who's in charge, but, and if it gets out of order, you can bring it back. But to allow venting, to listen carefully, to respond calmly at all times, not to get emotional and upset, to take history into account. That's just so important. That is so important. Every time I see this, I think, wow, Jim really captured what we were dealing with. Because you can't change history. And you can't tell people that history didn't happen. You can't tell North Tulsa that Greenwood didn't happen, because it did happen. And it still impacts how people feel. And if you can't see the world through somebody else's eyes, you're not going to be successful. You have your own set of values, you have your own philosophies and your philosophical bents. But if you can't turn around and look, and it doesn't mean that they're right, but you have to understand how they're looking at the world. And that's what we had to do. I remember sitting up at Gilcrease that night thinking, wow, they were lined up as deep as we could see that night. And, I could have taken the approach that it was racially charged, but on either side of me were black administrators who were terrific friends and great administrators. And they went after them as hard as they went after me. So it has to do with history, and it has to do with how they believe that they have been treated over time. And you have to realize that folks they're turning out if they're not emotionally driven. And ultimately, if you know how to deal with people and you know how to bring that in and you know how to channel that back, then ultimately it can become an asset. Now, when you're up there under the gun and it's coming as hard and fast as it does sometimes, it doesn't feel like that it's going to be an asset. But I just had to call attention to that. I still think, Jim, every time I see that, you really captured that in just some bullet points that are very important.
One of the things that I always tell myself before situations like that is to watch out for yourself. Are you just about to say, you've got to understand? Because nobody's got to understand. That's a bad way to approach an emotional situation. Much better way is, let me see if I understand. You know, you've got to let that venting happen. And pushing back, whether it's 10 times as hard or an eye for an eye, is not going to get you there. So, okay. Whenever I start a project, and I will tell you when the George Kaiser Family Foundation approached me and said, there's this TPS would be interested in perhaps having you help them. And I said, I really don't know a lot about education. And I was clear to Dr. Ballard, I don't have an educational background. I went to school for 1 million years, but probably not as long as you. I got the same answer from both of them. I don't know whether you guys rehearsed that or not, but said, well, there are plenty of people at TPS that know a lot about education. They don't need one more guy to tell them about education. What they need is one more guy to help them through change management, which was not a strength that TPS had, and much to Dr. Ballard's credit, he knew that. And oftentimes in a situation like this, it is easier to bring somebody from the outside, somebody who doesn't have or isn't already entwined with certain history at whether it's an organization or whatever you're dealing with. So I in turn then looked to others. I spoke with other school districts who had gone through similar situations. What Tulsa found itself in is a very typical situation. As baby boomers all went to school, more schools were built, more neighborhoods were built, and then as possible, those individuals moved out of the cities and moved into the suburbs. That depressed the population. The remaining population grew older. Those people weren't having children, and the schools became emptier and emptier. So what I did is I reached out to various school districts with Detroit, Dallas, and San Francisco, and New York, trying to see, okay, what worked and what didn't work. And interestingly enough, when I spoke to people at the top of the organization, everything worked great. And when I was able to speak to people who were not so high in the organization, they were able to tell you what worked and what didn't work. So that was something that I learned. No big surprise. High schools got the same warning from everybody. Be very careful about touching high schools. It's an emotional issue, but the American public is really committed to the high school. Sports, especially if it has a high reputation for sports or a particular reputation that's very strong in the state, it's a very difficult effort, let's say. Being inclusive, I will tell you that one of the school districts I talked to, they weren't inclusive. What they did is they took a map of the district and they said open, close, open, close, open, close. And they got it all done in an afternoon. And they sent it out, and it was a disaster because it didn't have any rhyme or reason behind it. And people didn't understand. They were not included. There was no input. It was just some administrators that sat around and literally picked and chose. We also got a very forgotten consent decrees and property restrictions. We got a tale of woe from, I think it was San Francisco, had a school downtown, and it was in a very high rent area. They knew if they closed it, they could sell the property, make quite a bit of money, and so they closed the school and put it up for sale. And as the property went for closure, someone stepped forward and said, well, this land was donated by the such and such family, and there's a reversionary interest. And so if it's ever not a school, if it's ever closed, it reverts back to the family, so they got nothing out of that. So that struck a chord with me, being an attorney. So we did quite a bit of property checking on what we did. I also reached out to the Gates Foundation that had just been here in Tulsa. TPS had gone through I think it was a full year effort working with the Gates Foundation on a massive grant. And although TPS did not receive the grant, Gates Foundation, the people there were very impressed and were very eager to help when I reached out to them. And then they put me in touch with several educational consulting firms, and they gave me some advice.
What we did, I'll just clarify a little
Sure.
bit, that we were one of 8 schools in America that Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation selected to work with them on a teacher-focused model. That they had done a lot of research and came up with what I or any practitioner knows, and that is the most important component in education is classroom teaching. You can have great schools that have great classroom teachers. And so of the 8 schools, there were going to have 4 that they were going to invest heavily, and by heavily I mean as much as $100 million for a school system, and that's what the school in Florida got. But they also invested pretty heavily with the other 4 districts. And so we were with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation for more than a year. And we continued to have a lot of contact with them. And in fact, it was one of the consultants, one of the employees of the Gates Foundation that really began talking with me about how we really, I mean, the first statistics that Jim put up there that showed, you know, with a certain number of students were in 56 schools and now we're in 90. I mean, that says it all. And we really weren't efficient in some areas. So, you know, we really needed to do that. But the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation was very instrumental. Another thing that Jim brought to my attention in the beginning, when he says he contacted 12 urban districts, he was very strategic in selecting districts that had gone through a similar kind of change. What got my attention, I'll let you go ahead and tell that story because he's the one that brought it to me.
I brought it to Dr. Ballard, and this was early on, and I said, Dr. Ballard, some of these districts have done an excellent job, and were very successful, and some did less and were unsuccessful. I said, but they all have one thing in common. And he said, well, what is that? And I said, no matter how successful they were, the superintendent didn't survive the process.
And none of them.
Not a single one. I said, so before we get too far down this road, you know, and to his credit, he said, you know, this is something that's got to get done, and then we'll just see what happens. And so I thought, well, all right, you know, this is a man who's put it all on the line. I guess I can do that too. Anyway, so I think it worked out all right.
Instead of getting fired, I got Tulsa of the Year the next
That's
year.
right.
So.
And then the flip side of the coin, you know, be open, is always, you know, you have to know the difference between data and information. Data is just numbers and words. Information is meaningful and tells you something. You learn from it. So gathering data is the easy task. Converting it to information is the productive task. And then, which data is correct? If you're going to base your decisions on facts and data, you want to make sure they are correct. And so I was asking a lot of questions, a lot of the same questions from different people to see what the answers were. And you know, communication is about the message received, not the message sent. Sometimes if you ask a question a little bit differently, the receiver poses a whole different question in their mind. So there's a lot of testing, proofing the data. And then when do you have enough information? I can tell you in the law and maybe in education too, you can research yourself well into depth. And at some point in time, you want to make something happen. You want the change to occur. And so there's a sense of, okay, do I have sufficient information to make big decisions, make big recommendations? And I will show you the process. The decisions were not mine, certainly not mine. And then how many players are too many players? It's easy to manage a group of 5, a little more difficult, a group of 10. A group of 50 is much more difficult. I mean, you're in the classroom, you see classrooms, you know what it takes. You can be overly inclusive. And the other thing I will say is, if you know you have an individual who is part of your team, and that individual does not subscribe to the mission that you are, that your team is committed to, they are an individual who is going to make the group fail, and that's going to be their mission. You have to be strong enough to call it for what it is, and you have to give that individual a chance. I give one chance. Are you with us or not? It's not, are you against us? It's, are you with us? You got to be with us. And if you're not, thank you so much for your interest, and we'll call it. And then they're out. Or you can be outmaneuvered by one bad apple. Okay, I just want to give you a little bit of background because this is what I walked into. I interviewed every one of Dr. Ballard's direct reports, and these are some of the comments that I got back. And there are no names on them because I don't think anybody. I told them they would all be anonymous. I wanted the truth. But you're dealing with people, and people have different feelings. But you got to know where they are, so you know who's committed and who isn't. Do we really believe our mission statement? Do we think we have the ability to actually do this? Do you think we can? Are we creative enough, or are we just stuck in our old ways? And then, do we have the gonads to make this happen? In other words, is this going to be a lot of talk and a lot of work, and then at the end of the day, we'll all go home for summer vacation? Others, do we want to recreate the past? No, please don't turn to the past. We want to create a new future. This is the way we've always done it. I don't know a better way to do it because this is how I grew up doing it. This is what I've been doing for 20 years. Issues like, well, I don't know why we need to change. What's so bad with what we've got? The emotional attachments, we've already talked about that. That can be turned around and use that emotion to spur a group forward. And then we did have, Omaha was one of the places that we looked at. Being able to pick up something from somewhere else that has a different history, a different culture, it's totally different, and then superimposing it on your own situation typically does not work. You can pick up ideas, but it's very, very few times that you can pick up and wholesale drop something in. It really has to be successful, it really has to be tailored. A lot of fear. This came up over and over. Fear of change, unknown. There was a lot of, what this building, we had parents come, I went to this building. You go, okay, well, what's so special about this building? Over and over again. This building is so special. What is so special? It's not the building. It's not the bricks. It's not the mortar. It's the teachers in the classroom. It's the administrators. That's what made it special. If you could start to talk to these people and they'd say, oh, this is the greatest building, Miss So-and-so was there and Mr. So-and-so was there. It's all about the people. The people, so being able to differentiate between closing a school and reallocating teachers. You'll see there's a commitment here. Part of the process is to reallocate teachers, not just to disperse them. Moving from they to us. That's so important. That's how you know when people are getting in the tent. And just a lot of trust issues. As with in any change, there's always a trust issue. Most people think that in any change, the number one question in everyone's mind is, what's in it for me? And that's really, statistically, not the number one question. Statistically, the number one question is, what are you going to do to help me change? What are you going to do to help me change? You can't just tell people to change or force people to change. You've got to help you change. And then communications. You cannot over-communicate, especially during a transition, especially during turmoil. Everyone wants to know more. Everyone, if there's a gap in any information, people make it up. They fill in that gap. And then those things are hard to put away. This business of Dr. Ballard having a list in his pocket went on for months. And reporters asked the question, can we see it? We won't print it, but can we just see it? It doesn't exist. So communication is just key. And I will tell you this, I didn't bring it. The communications effort for this project was awarded by the National Public Relations Society as an outstanding example of transparency and widespread communication.
That's a huge national award. Huge. And the gentleman who was our communications director of Tulsa Public Schools at that time is now the communications director for Tulsa Union. And in fact, I talked to him today, and he'll be coming later in this class. He'll be coming and talking with you about the importance of communication in the community. So, Chris Payne is his name.
We talked about emotions. We talked a little bit already. Dr. Ballard talked a little bit about perceptions of equity. Don't ever fool yourself. Perceptions are reality. You can shape them. You can turn them, but they have to be dealt with. Telling someone what you just said is false, is not going to get you where you need to go. Explaining to them how that reality, that's a perception, but the reality is somewhere over here. That's the way to get there. We had a lot of issues with McLean High School. It's the only high school north of 244.
Of course, we know that's not exactly true because McT Washington is also.
Right. But the perception was.
But the perception, that's why he has perception of equity up there. I want to make sure you catch his point.
A lot of discussion, we had a lot of meetings with leadership from the African American community, and it was surprising to me how divided some of them were, and how they didn't all agree on the direction forward, and that just meant that each of those groups then had to also be dealt with individually. You can't just make an assumption that one speaker speaks for an entire community.
That is so true. That really surprised me as well. But you have to figure out, you have to spend a lot of time, you have to figure out who's going to be the most impactful. And I'll say this much about that one of the things that emerged from this initiative is that I made lifelong friends with the African American pastors in North Tulsa. They are very influential and countless meetings.
A lot of
If you want to
meetings.
go through change, you have to be prepared to work really, really hard. It can't just be that old myth of, well, I'll figure out what to do and we'll do it. You have to understand the community, and this is where we got the most pushback, although that meeting that I had as far south as you can go, that night down in Mayo, whenever I was thinking about selling Mayo, wasn't exactly a cakewalk. But our relationships with the African American pastors with the faith-based community was extremely valuable to me. And I actually got that idea. Who was the tight end that played for the Philadelphia Eagles in the OU Sooners? He left professional football early to go back to Arkansas, where he started doing work with youth disadvantaged. Who was it? Keith Jackson. How can I not remember his name? It's something I'm getting older. I heard Keith Jackson speak within a couple of weeks after I was named superintendent at Tulsa Public. I heard Keith Jackson speak, and he talked about the faith-based community, and he talked about relationships, and he's done some amazing work in Little Rock. And that was really the first inclination that, if you can't form relationships, look, you're gonna hear this, you're starting a doctorate program at the University of Oklahoma, you can't escape me, you're gonna have me for a couple of classes, and you're gonna have me for your internship before you finish, and you're gonna hear me say this so many times, it's all about relationships, it's always about relationships. You can't form relationships, you can't succeed, that's all there is to it. We would have never done this without the ability to form relationships all over the community, with the mayor's office, with the Tulsa Regional Chambers, with faith-based all over town. We couldn't have done it without forming those. It's not good enough to make your way into a chair. You make your way into a chair, and you believe you're the only thinker because you made it to that chair, well, I promise you you'll fail.
These are still some of the comments. A lot of concern about time, a lot of pushback from staff saying, I think what we have here is a minimum of a 2-year project. And I took the position, I think I know I was persuasive, that said, if we can't get this done in a school year, this was not gonna happen. That the longer we drag this out, the easier it's gonna be just to be buried in the data, and it's just not gonna happen. And then there was a concern about the politics. Ultimately, the board has to accept this, and of course, those are elected decisions, and they are subject to the constraints of their constituents, which is why it's an elected decision. And the question was, if you do all this work and we come up with a perfect solution, what if the board just says no? And then we've spent all this time, and it's a lot of work. I just can't, I can't overplay that. So who were all these players? Okay, so this is an effort. When we first rolled this out, everybody thought the structure was too complicated, but my goal was to do a couple of things. Number one, make sure that Dr. Ballard could be the champion of the change, but that meant that he couldn't be participating in the change, in the initial change discussions, because then it would be, well, he's just talking about that list of the schools that he's got in his pocket that he's going to close. So what you do is you have your champion out there cheering on the other groups, but they're independent. Obviously, they're influential, but they're not in the day-to-day operations. Okay. Okay. So in the middle is me, because I got to do the chart, so I put me in the middle. So you see, there's a project team. This is senior staff at TPS. Their goal is to make sure they were committed. We're going to get this done in a school year, and they had the staff that could generate the data that we could then turn into information. We had an advisory council. The advisory council was a group of citizens, non-TPS people from each of the districts, from each of the
Board districts. Yeah.
right, board districts, right?
Board wards is what you're trying to do.
Oh, that's right. And their goal was to see the data turn into information, see if they understood that information, did they believe that information, did they need more information to shore it up, and that would sometimes send it back to the project team for more research. And then we had the Blue Sky group, which was my favorite group. Blue Sky group were professionals, teachers from TPS, and their assignment was this. You have a blank sheet of paper, you're going to create the best 21st century education model, and money is almost no object. And their job was to do research. They did amazing research across all the country, research on what works, what doesn't work, what it works some of the time, so who does it work for, and then what structures, what school structures are best, what are the non-educational supports that are needed in our school system, and how do you put all that together and then superimpose it onto what reality is, that we have these buildings. How do you take those resources that we have, that perfect world, and superimpose it on that and see how it fits best? So that group broke into 3 teams.
This is really, I always say, when I see this slide, and I said at the time, although I didn't realize just how brilliant it was, this is the brilliance of Jim McCarthy right here. What he just said to you at the outset was that he was thinking through what everybody's role was. He took me out of the process, and he put in place a process that had a lot of input. At the end, I was the point person. I was the one who stood in front of the board. I was the one who worked with the board members. But so much of that was deflected early on. I mean, the Blue Sky met up here every single Saturday. How many weeks did you miss?
15 Saturdays in a row.
In a row. Now you gotta understand the importance of this, that they came up here 15 straight Saturdays and came up with all of these ideas. And then all of that filtered through the process, and then one day, I was the one who stood up in front of the press and said, here are the 3 plans. Well, I didn't construct those 3 plans. Those 3 plans had so much input, and it was so carefully selected on who made it to the Blue Sky and how you worked through the process. And the other point that he made, there was an oversight group, and they were appointed by board members and myself, who appointed an oversight committee, and I said, I will not take anything forward if the oversight committee doesn't agree to it. Because you see, leadership is not just one person making it into a chair, and because they made it, that they get to make all the decisions. Leadership is taking people along with you, is making people a part of the process, and that's what made it successful. And it really was because of the structure right here and how this was set up. And, it's almost like I want to say it wasn't this easy, because when we're making this presentation, it looks like, wow, you guys succeeded, you got it done. And I want to say over and over again, it wasn't that easy. We had one person on the oversight group who actually, we had to ask that person to step down. We had to ask that person to step down because that person could not be part of a collaborative group. They just couldn't. So it wasn't without sparks. It wasn't without difficulty. All of that happened. So it's about understanding that leadership is a process, not just making your way into a position and then telling everybody how it's going to be. That would have never worked. In fact, it wouldn't have worked. We wouldn't have gotten it done. If we would have gotten it done, then I certainly would have and should have been fired over leading in that way. But this chart right here really kind of speaks to the essence of how we went about this. And you have to know yourself. I would never come up with something that brilliant. Never. I know my strengths. I know my weaknesses. I'm always working to fill in my weaknesses, and I try and capitalize on my strengths. You get a lot of really smart people working behind the scenes 15 straight Saturdays. You got McCarthy heading the thing up, and then you give it to me. I can do it in front of the camera. I can get up in front of a group. I can do that. I did that. But it was all of this brilliance that was going on behind. I had no idea what this was going to look like. In fact, it would have been a sad state of affairs if they would have left it up to just me to kind of figure out how I wanted it on.
Well, it was a process, and there was not always laughter and unicorns going on. Yes,
No.
ma'am.
How were people selected for the Blue Sky group? Was it just strictly voluntary?
Well, I think there were nominations. We were looking for, I didn't know any of those people. These were all new people to me. So I relied heavily on Dr. Ballard and his staff. We wanted people who were innovative. The demographic tended to be younger than older, and high energy people. Their commitment was from 8 to noon, right? Every Saturday. 2:30, 3 o'clock, they were still there. They were so committed to this. The energy level, although the number of, I can't tell you how many dozen donuts were consumed during those.
That's really a great question. That is a great question to ask, because I could have manipulated and controlled the process by putting people in place that I wanted to be there. Rather, you could self-nominate, you got nominations from other people, we just threw it all out there. And then senior staff did say, these are the folks that we think need to be there.
Okay.
It was a big group too.
Yes. Well, the groups grew. Once there was a certain point when you could see that the organization, the tipping point, the organization was buying in that, you know what, this just might happen. And then the enthusiasm level went up dramatically because there was some momentum that we had got.
So you had Blue Sky, you had Project that Jim's gonna talk about, and then you had the
Advisory council.
The advisory council, and board members appointed those folks.
Yeah.
Board members, and I had to say, I think we took a couple of people from each ward.
Project team, like I told you, that's the executive team, kind of been over all of this. Their responsibility was to keep the thing going, keep it on schedule, move it along, make sure we had the right resources, make sure that we didn't get any dead ends from staff that said, I don't have time to get to this information, I got a full-time job already. They met for the full 9 months, once a week, and they weren't always thrilled to be there. But they came and they were productive, and that's where the data began to turn into information.
And Bob Burton, I don't know that he was the official head of it, was he?
Yeah, we
Yeah.
named him as leader.
So we did have someone internally who was in charge of that long time, Tulsa, graduate of Booker T, and really at one time was the interim superintendent of Tulsa Public. So he's very skilled, very connected all over the city. So we have really good leadership there.
This, we've already talked about the advisory council. These are the representatives from around the district. And they met for 12 weeks to review and assess the data and the proposals. They had full veto power to say, I don't believe it. You're gonna have to bring something else back to me, or I want somebody else to come in here and explain this to me. That was their job, and they took it very seriously. And as Dr. Ballard said, we had to ask for one individual to step down. She just wasn't with the program. The Blue Sky group, we've already talked about this group again. This was the fun group, and I guess they met for 12 weeks. But I'll tell you what, they were thrilled and very proud of their product. And then we have Dr. Ballard, I told you, the champion. He was the board contact for us, prime communicator. It's always best when, especially if the change management is public, you have one face, one voice that's going to speak about the subject matter. And that's the one you put out there. And it should be your champion if at all possible. And as I say, he was not, however, a member of any of the working groups. That neutrality is critically important when he speaks, because he's being advised and he speaks from a position of authority, not a position of the day-to-day operations.
Who was, were you a part of all the meetings to make sure?
Yes.
Okay, I was wondering if you would just go in and just be a butterfly on the wall kind of deal, make sure.
We didn't have any butterflies. It was all elbows and
That's a really good question, Randy, because I remember attending one Blue Sky meeting, and that was when they kicked it off, and I never went back. My presence alone could have tainted the process. I didn't attend, I don't think I ever attended one project. So you had Blue Sky going through the project that looked at all of the nuts and bolts, and they were churning out all this stuff, and then they were going to the oversight. And I would attend, I don't know, if they had 12 meetings, the oversight, I'm sure that I didn't attend more than 3.
yeah, not very many.
No.
You and I met every week.
Oh, yeah,
Uh,
I met every week.
Kind of, here's where we are in the process. And here's what's working, here's what's not working. I need to know,
And Jim, you were in all those meetings that I had with the board members.
You see, if you can't get it done at the end, Randy, if you can't get it done at the end, then it's all for naught. So you have to think about not only putting together something that people all feel that they have input into, but can you get it done? So, and we did not give, I think the best filter we had in this whole thing was the oversight group. Because nothing was gonna be done if the oversight didn't approve of it.
Right.
That's all there is to it. So it had to come through them. And we can have all this other stuff going on, but even like with our meeting with the board, we met with individual board members or 2 board members at a time, and we took their input. They are, after all, the elected board members, but they didn't drive it. They did not drive it, because even their suggestions had to go back through the oversight. And if the oversight, the advisory didn't approve of it, it wasn't going to go anywhere. And then they got to vote on it in the end. And I will say this, as I look back over Schoolhouse and I think about how we got that done, I think the most significant thing was that we had, in the very end, we had, out of a 7-member board, we had a 6-1 board. Now, interestingly, it was a 5-2 vote. The reason it was a 5-2 vote, the lady who switched her vote that evening was not a strong board member, a wonderful lady, a caring person. And I really liked her a lot. But this lady that we had to ask to lead the oversight committee approached her the night of the board meeting. I saw it all unfold. I saw her walk up to her and just get right in her ear. And this person, board member, just couldn't handle that kind of pressure because the other lady was a prominent citizen. And she walked up to me after the encounter and said, Dr. Ballard, I believe so much in what you're doing. I want this to pass, and I believe it's going to pass. One thing I've never done ever in my entire career was ask board members how they were going to vote. Never. You just don't do that. Instead, you know them well enough to know how it's going to go. And we had gone through so many public hearings, and we've gone through so much that I knew where we were without anybody, and nobody ever told me they were going to vote yes, except for her. And she called me that afternoon and said, I really like what you did. I admire it. I respect it. I'm going to vote yes. So I said, you don't have to tell me I'm going to vote. Well, she ended up changing her vote minutes before the board. So Project Schoolhouse went down on a 5-2 vote. And by went down, I mean it passed 5-2. And I don't want to get ahead of everything. I just want to tell you that on the night we took the vote, we had a hearing before that, a week or so or a few days before that. And there were several hundred people, probably 250 or 300 who showed up. And I don't remember how many speakers we had that night. You may have it here.
I don't remember.
But there was so much going on behind the scenes. The lady who was in charge of education for the Tulsa Regional Chamber of Commerce approached me and said, we're paying attention to people. You have to sign up in advance. We're paying attention to who signs up. And I'm telling you, we're going to match them. Tit for tat, we're going to match them. And the third speaker of the night was the mayor.
Right.
The mayor doesn't just go out and speak at events like this, but one person would speak and they were matched with someone who was pro. I mean, it was, and by pro, they were for it. And so on the night that we actually took the vote, there were 3 speakers on the night that we actually took the vote.
It was fine with me.
Damn sure fine with me, buddy.
Okay. And then, of course, the board. I will tell you a little bit about the board, and this is something that I learned from one of the other school districts. I did a presentation to the board at the beginning of this process on how I was proposing that it would work, and I asked the board to vote to approve the process because I wanted it locked in stone, and we didn't want anything at midway or at the end saying, well, we don't like your process, so all bets are off. So we asked them to formally approve the process, and then formally commit to an up or down vote on the proposal that was ultimately to be presented. Because several of the school districts found themselves in situations when the board went to vote, they said, well, we like this part of this idea, but we want you to change that part over here, and we think this blue thing should be green over there, and there's no time to figure out what the implications are, what the secondary and tertiary results are, and you're stuck, and then you can get unintended consequences. So they committed to both those things, the process they approved, and that it would be an up or down vote. There was not going to be any board tweaking. There would be some proposal that went through the entire process that they had approved that would be ultimately brought to the board by Superintendent Ballard, and then it would be up and down. And that was good. And they said yes. And then I just can't say enough about communications. As Dr. Ballard has said over and over again, we had numerous public meetings. We met at schools. We sought input. We did surveys. We did employee surveys. We did parent surveys. We did internet surveys where you didn't even have to, anybody could weigh in. You didn't have to have any investment in TPS whatsoever. Ultimately, we came up with, or the Blue Sky group came up with 3 different proposals. Those were all rolled out. One of the things in change management, you want to make sure that people feel that they still have their hands on the steering wheel, right up to the end of the process. So you can roll out 3 different concepts, and then what do you think? What's your idea? How do you feel about each of these? You're still in control. No one is shoving this down your throat. You're still in control. This has gone through the whole process. What do you think? And we got some great, I will say some of the best feedback from those meetings where people said, well, I think this is really good, but what about tweaking this part over there? We said, well, we'll study that. We'll see what we can do. And it's a tool that sometimes helps when there are still some big emotions out there.
Were all 3 of your proposals equitable in their own stand-up, right? Or
Yes.
was there a good, better, and best in
No.
your mind?
They came from the Blue Sky group, and I'll tell you what, if I had put the members of that group up there, they would have advocated to the death for their particular.
Yeah, it came from them, and it came through Project.
Yeah.
To clean it up.
Right.
And to make sure that it could be accomplished. But that was, and I keep saying this, so I guess I don't know what was the most brilliant part of it, but coming through with 3 proposals.
Vastly different.
That were different. I mean, vastly different, but they were equitable and they were workable. And, they were given to me, and Jim briefed me and everything, and I stood up and said, here are the 3 proposals. I mean, this is what they came up with, and it came out of Project. Here they are. And that was a huge media event.
It was. And we named them different colors.
Yeah.
Just to avoid the A, B, C, or 1, 2, 3, some kind of ranking. We just gave them 3 different colors. And you're going to actually see those. Okay, so we're going to move on here. And so anyway, that's that again. So the framework. Basic tenets of any change management. Every participant must believe the status quo is not acceptable. Period. The human nature is to hang on to the status quo, always. So if you give anybody an inkling of, well, we don't really have to do this, there's only a 99% chance we're going to do this. You're done. Had to make sure everyone understood we had a district-wide problem. It needed a district-wide solution. This wasn't a problem at school A, B, and C. This was a problem that the district had. And so there were no sacred cows. Everybody had skin in the game. We had to acknowledge, what was working, and then we had to be just as open and honest with what was not working. And that's not easy. I mean, that's an easy thing to say, but it's really hard when it's your turn to stand up and you say, I'm flunking this. I really am flunking. It's hard. And then the commitment to create what was new. We weren't looking for a solution that was an old solution. Okay. So these are the 10 things that we measured. And these were based on other school systems that were measured, and like I said, the Gates Foundation and some consulting groups. We looked at basic demographics. So What does that mean? Okay, well, this was all about population change. So it's okay to know what the population is today, but what's the population going to be? That's what we're planning for in the future. And so to do that, there are specialists that can do that, and that's what we did. We hired a demographic specialist who actually happened to be here in town. And it just showed that enrollment change, what we didn't want to do is say we're going to close all these schools and then 5 years from now we're going to need them all back. Because, I mean, that's just double the work. So we did just school-aged children, what was the change in demographics. And as you can see, through 2020, it was less than a 5% growth. So, you know, we just needed to know that much flexibility needed to be held in there. However, then you have to break it down a little bit more. Okay, it's 5% growth over Tulsa Public Schools, but where is it going to be changing? So, as we broke it down by then existing school patterns, the actual school patterns, there was going to be as low as a 9% loss of population through 2020 to a 13% increase over at in the Emerson School District. So then you have to kind of map that out. This is how we're changing data into information. And then we did the same thing for the middle schools and the high schools. Notice, okay. Then we took, demographics. We took a look at, remember it was initially the motto was the district of choice. And basically the theory was, if you wanted to go to school somewhere in TPS, just pick your school and go there. Okay? Just because you live across the street from this school doesn't mean you go to that school. You could go anywhere because, quite frankly, there were empty seats everywhere. So, and it was really better. To be honest, it was better if I could get more kids in my school. I might get another teacher. If I get another teacher, might be I'm able to offer just a little bit more. So, unbeknownst, I sensed that there was a lot of this salesmanship going on. You should come to my school. Yeah, you should come to my school. Yeah, you should come. And then I get more kids. So, what this is showing you is at Barnard, which is this tall 94% of the students going to Barnard had transferred in from a different school. 94% of the people outside of the Barnard area thought, I should send my kid to Barnard because something's really good going on there. Right?
Like, okay, I'm a basketball coach, so how does that go when?
That's the round one, right? Basketball.
Yeah. So when, like, because you can't recruit kids for athletics, but you can but you're saying you can recruit them to come to your school.
I didn't say it was a public thing. I'm saying
Okay.
it was just like you do in athletics, they were doing that in academics.
Okay.
Okay. So anyway, what this was showing was just
Look at the Travis Hill files.
Yeah.
this is just showing you
I'm
the
not saying I
disparity.
approved of it at the time.
We put this all under the heading of the grass is always just a little bit greener, not at my school,
Right.
at somebody else's school. Yes.
How did the transportation work if all of these kids were going to Barnard? I mean, we weren't traveling, we didn't have buses going everywhere in Tulsa taking them to that school, did we?
Well, one of the things we looked at was transportation. Parents were happy to drive their children. Happy to drive their children in excess of 5 miles.
So they could go anywhere, but they would still be on a certain bus route for a certain school, correct?
They could be on a bus route to a certain point, but they often ended up taking them themselves.
Right.
They often ended up taking, that was going to be their responsibility, just like it is in magnet schools today in Tulsa.
Exactly.
They're responsible for providing their own transportation.
Did you see a lot of parents driving in the bus stops?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And then the parents' cars wait until the bus gets there. Okay, I want to show you, this is transfers in, people that transferred in, and Barnard was the highest.
No, I just think it's.
This is transferred out. 85% of the kids who lived in Barnard School District transferred out because they knew Barnard wasn't so great, right? It was like, what's going on?
That was an aha moment for me. When they brought that to me, I'm like, wait a minute.
That was strange.
You mean to tell me that over 90% of the kids who are eligible, are coming into Barnard, 93% of them, 94%, and that 85% are going out?
That's the kind of craziness all around,
It was all over.
all around, and there were so many seats available. I will still never forget whenever it was all said and done, and I was looking at some data with Oliver Wallace, who's a really smart data guy. And I said, I can't believe that we've changed this much. And Oliver looked at me and he said, well, Doc, you closed down the lanes. And you know, Oliver's from Tulsa and he's very steeped and versed in all of that. And he said, you just closed down the lanes. That's what stopped a lot of that transfer, because there weren't any longer
All these
places
empty
for
seats.
people just to go.
Yeah.
And people got up, I used to say people got up in the morning and said, where am I gonna go?
Right.
Where's the grass greener? And I mean, that happened all over the city. Where am I gonna go? Did athletics figure into it? Of course it did. And I think what Schoolhouse did was, well, we closed 14 or 15 schools completely, but also the reconfiguration had a huge part to do with it, and how we went, what we did at Rogers and some of the other places.
Okay, so that's part of the demographics we looked at. Facility utilization rate, this is, basically, how many kids do you have going there? 17% of the elementary schools were below 70%. 70% is about a break-even percentage, according to the research that was done, to efficiently run a building. If you're running a building with fewer than 70%, less than 70% capacity, you're wasting utilities, you're wasting light and everything else. Okay. 34% of the elementary schools had fewer than 300 students in grades 1 through 5. Why was that important? Well, the structure was, it's good to have 3 sections in the grade. So if you have 1 through 5, you've got 5 grades, that's 15, so that's 20 per classroom. Okay, if you can't get 20 in a classroom, then you're running into your problem with staffing. You're running into your teacher staffing issues. And 34 elementary schools, 34. 8 of the middle schools were below 70 and 3 of the high schools were below 70%. All this said was way gross underutilization.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yes.
Just in terms of how we're using how you're phrasing that, it's safe to say that if you were to say they're at capacity, or like, how would you say they're at break even in terms of that 70% below capacity?
Okay, that was
70%.
70% below capacity was taking how many classrooms they had and putting 20 students in a classroom, which is a luxury, as I understand it. Right?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
But it doesn't really matter whether we use 20 or whether we use 30. What mattered was that you were consistent all the way across to determine what was at capacity. And of course, 20 is kind of an eye-popping number. But what's important is that you have consistency.
Your goal from a monetary standpoint is just to break even in a school. You're not trying to turn a profit, right? But you're noticing you're losing money here. That's what those numbers indicate, right?
But you're, as a steward, certainly a steward of tax dollars, your obligation is to be as efficient as possible.
Right.
So that, you can spend $1 on one carpet tile, or you can spend $1 and carpet the entire room. The goal is to stretch those dollars, especially as the state is squeezing down on how many dollars you're getting.
You see, I think that's really a good question and a good observation. We did not really refer to the monetary advantages. We knew they were there. We never referred to them. What we referred to was opportunity. If you have a school that's 50% capacity, you cannot provide some of the opportunities. If you combine 2 schools, which is what I really truly believe, and it was change initiated by different reasons that TPS just recently went through. It was change out of necessity because they were losing money. But I wholly and totally approve, and it doesn't matter what I approve of now or not, but I do approve of what they did. They were forced into it, and what they did was they closed a couple of elementary and they moved all those kids into one. And the point I'm making is we're going to provide more opportunities for the kids at Clinton Elementary School than we were providing at Park or we were providing at Remington, period. Plus, we're going to save Webster by doing that.
To me, that was the key in that. And I think that reasoning was totally consistent with the decisions that we made during Schoolhouse. Only they didn't have the luxury of going through all of the processes that we did. But if you look at that, it exactly followed the line of thinking. And I believe that the decision makers, because I still talk to decision makers at TPS, I believe they were influenced by the rationale that we used. And I think it's really good what they did. I think they saved Webster by going to a 6 through 12.
All right. Academic performance, obviously it's about academics. No matter, a lot of people think public school is about sports, it's really about academics. Okay, a lot of discussion here about what should be the bar, what should be the measure, and we had finally came to an agreement. It would be the proficiency as defined by the state, and that was whether that was a good one or a bad one. It was the one that the state had. 19 in the elementary schools, 50% or fewer scores at or above proficiency. 5 of the middle schools at 50%. 5 of the high schools at 50%. And the graduation rate, high school graduation rate for TPS didn't meet the state standards. So these were some of the disappointing pieces of information that came out. And were shocking to many people as we made them public. We put them on the website, and of course they were immediately picked up by the media. And how could this happen? Over and over, I would say, that's not what we're doing. This is not trying to find out whose fault something is. We're trying to figure out what we can do to move forward and be better. And this just shows you high school graduation. Remember, this was 2011, so we were looking at prior years, and that's just some of the data that we put out there. We looked at the physical plants, the operational cost per student. Once again, if you have too few students and you're doing everything to a great big building, the cost per student is exceptionally high. This $1,100 is obviously at a high school. It has a lot of that was with the cost of maintaining the sports areas, which is very expensive. But you look at elementary schools, $174 per student at one school, and almost $700 per student at another. That's where you get into these efficiency numbers. What's the smarter thing to do? The good news on the physical plant was because of the citizens of Tulsa, they're virtually all in great shape. But the truth was, some of them were very old. We had elementary school from 1918, middle school from 1926, and high school from 1938. And the truth of the matter is, whether you're a person or a building, the older you get, you may get a knee replaced, or you may get hair plugs, but the parts wear out, and that's just the truth. So the point there being, if you had a more modern building, it's very likely that it was built in it was more efficient in terms of heating and cooling. It may have, so those were things that were taken into account. Location. We looked at where schools were being built, and because they were built as neighborhoods grew up, we found them in clusters, because that's where the homes that were being built. And so we made note and found these what we called school clusters, with the thought being that if we have to close something, it's much more palatable to close something within a cluster where there are other schools still very close, and you still have that neighborhood feeling. So we saw 17 elementary schools have 4 other elementary schools within that distance. And that's kind of the 1.5 mile distance, which we initially had thought was palatable for parents to either have their kids ride the bus or take them to school. We found out later when we did the surveys, they were happy to go well over 5 miles. But we just started with that particular distance. Oh yeah, here I have it. Yeah, they were happy to go over 5 miles if they could go to the school of their choice. We looked at program considerations. What's going on in the school in terms of academics? At the elementary school, we had 12 elementary schools with split classes. get 2 grades in the class. I mean, just, that's not equitable to some kid that's got only first graders in his class. Now you got first and second graders. We had only a handful of the elementary schools offered computers, computer classes. Many had computers in the classroom, but they didn't have anything that actually taught the kids how to use the computers. And many schools didn't have the 3 sections per grade, which was what had been recommended. We looked at the middle schools. Elective classes ranged from only 21 being offered at Cleveland, 78 at Wilson. Is that an equitable situation? And then it was even greater distinction between McLean and Madison. Just not equitable. We looked at other community services that were being offered, because clearly schools are not only about academics and sports. They're also, a cog within the local community. Our community schools, they're the places, especially in the elementary schools, where the kids have clubs, scouts, other different activities, and that's all to be encouraged. Noted as we did the surveys that community involvement drops off dramatically after the elementary school. People, I think that's a symbiotic thing. The kids don't want the parents there. Parents are tired of the kids. When they get to that age, it's a tough age. And then it drops off further in high schools, as long as you carve out sports. Once you put sports back in, the community involvement, or what we call, goes dramatically up. Wide disparity in the Partners in Education program. This came out during some of the survey work we did. We had schools that had no partners in education, and we had schools that had like 24 partners in education. And albeit that's a voluntary arrangement, and there was just really not equitable. And then the magnet schools had virtually no community involvement, because once again, the kids were coming from all different directions, and they weren't really based within that community. We looked at the culture. We interviewed or surveyed the principals and the teachers at the schools, and we noted that there were many references to the strong commitment that the teachers had, the love they had for the children, the extra efforts they go to, the extra expense they go to, how caring they were. But then on the flip side, when you look at the questions as we set them up, there were very few references to being proud of being a member of that school, of talking about the strength of the family commitment to that particular school, and that very few mention of that the faculty and staff were exploring more efficient teaching methods and coming up with innovative ideas for the challenging environment that the school systems are today. So the takeaway from that was we're committing all of our heart and soul into the education, but we're doing the best we can with what we got. We looked at safety. Every school should be safe. And this is another big controversial measure. What should be safe? We started with how many kids were expelled and or reprimanded somehow. Got to do a big debate about that, because at that school they let you get away with anything, but over at this school they make you toe the line, and so that's not really a fair comparison. We ended up using Tulsa Police Department's Part 1 crimes. We said, okay, it's relatively arbitrary, but it's going to be the same all the way across the city. And we talked about crimes committed on school property, and then crimes committed within a 1 mile radius of the school property. And this is what Part 1 crimes are. These are not, having a bag of pot in your. These are real crimes. These cut to the heart of being safe. So here's what we found out. Over the past 2 years, at this time, no high school has been Part 1 crime free. That came as a huge shock. A lot of those were break-ins into cars, but there were drive-by shootings. So these were some shocking things. Only 2 middle schools have been crime-free over the past 2 years, and only half of the elementary schools. So this raised a real flag, and it was, here's the environment that these school buildings are in. We also found out that 2 of the schools were outside the TPD jurisdiction, and therefore, if there was a problem, they were not going to respond. That the county sheriff would have to be called, and of course, the sheriff's jurisdiction is huge, and the response time is dramatically different from the local police department. And the other thing we found out is the perception by parents and students, because we talked to some students too, is that school, when they're in school, they are safe. They feel safe. I interviewed a young man who said that he was home and he was in bed and he heard gunshots and he jumped out of his window and he ran to school. And he waited in the vestibule or in the waiting area outside the school because he felt safer there than where he was. So, and then I had to throw in the legal obligations and restrictions because I could bring something to that table. There were no consent decrees that we had to worry about. 2 of the properties do have reversionary interests on the original deed, so if they're not used as a school, TPS would lose them. 1 property had a deed restriction that it could only be, it's the same impact really, it could only be used as a school. And the big stickler was that there was bond money utilized to maintain and improve virtually every school in the system. And those bonds, some of those bonds, talked about if the school is sold, the bond money had to be returned. So, I mean, this is a big hickey. It really caught a lot of us off guard. Yeah, that's your question.
Could you speak to the first bullet point? The
Consent decrees. Some of the schools, at a time when desegregation was being court ordered, some court orders said, you have to integrate and you can't avoid this by closing that school and that school. They have to stay open. Tulsa didn't have any. Now Oklahoma City has a number of those, but there was no court ordered integration in Tulsa, so they didn't have those. That's the biggest area that you're going to find.
The best point about that is, from the outside, it looked like, so they closed some schools and they had some hearings. But you have to be so thorough if you're going to be successful at anything that you do. You have to be so thorough on the inside to look into those. And I say that because I said the same thing. Well, what's his consent decree, Jim? You have to have people looking at everything so that you know where you are. You don't want to get there and then you find out you had some, legal reason you couldn't do it.
Right.
It's a good question.
It's sort of like you don't want to pass Vision 2025 to bring BMX here to the fairgrounds and then come out later and say, Coke and Pepsi, we don't play nice together. You should do that work up front. Anyway, that's off topic. We did surveys, and this is some of the excerpts from the surveys when we asked parents, teachers, and principals. TPS needed to. This is after all the data's out. And these are sort of reactions to the data through surveys. Need to address the lack of equity. It was very clear there was a lack of equity in educational opportunities. Need to figure out a way where we don't have to keep moving our kids from one side of town to the other. And then safety, that really caught a lot of people off guard. Okay, so what were the results here? Blue skies, we talked about, developed three proposals that address the major issues. I'm going to show you those real quickly. Project team solicited grassroots proposals from the community forums, when we went out there, we said, hey, what does this work? In fact, we were invited, I forgot which school now, we were actually invited out to one school, and they said, we like this proposal, but have you thought about changing this, that, and the other thing? And we incorporated a couple of those ideas, and I forgot now, this all kind of blends together. We did have the finance group analyzed each of the 3 proposals. What was the economic impact? We surely didn't want to hurt ourselves, from an economic standpoint, because the commitment was that the savings, as much as possible of the savings, would be plowed back into the classroom for, broader services and broader educational opportunities. Of course, the advisory council reviewed, discussed the proposals, and the recommendation, Dr. Ballard, as he said, stood up at the board meeting on May 2 and called for, he said, I recommend this, but it's your call, and they voted.
And I think it was very significant that from the very beginning, that Jim had this constructed, that you weren't gonna pick and choose. And that's by being very thorough in your research before you got there. That would have probably never occurred to me. But he found that that was a major issue everywhere else. And so we made it really clear, it's gonna come. And people would ask me, who's gonna make the recommendation? And you wanna play leader? Then you gotta know when to look people in the eye and say, I'm going to do it. I'll assure you that I don't have a list. I'll assure you that I'm going to get a lot of input. I'll assure you that I'm going to be critical of every piece of the process. But when it comes down to it, I'll make the recommendation. That's my role, and I will do that. And it was quite a moment when that boat went down and we had achieved, and we had a reporter come from where, San Antonio,
Yes, and
El Paso, and spend a week with us, just saying, we're researching these. The only place where we can find out that it really seemed to be successful, and I'm not saying everything was perfect, but was in Tulsa, and they came and stayed and did a big story, and you can ask Payne about this even further whenever he comes here, because they won a national award from how they did this. And I think the point is that, well, first of all, you got to get the right people, and you have to get the right people on the bus. This would not have happened had it not been for Jim McCarthy. That's why he's the one who needs to tell the story. I could get up there and tell the story with his PowerPoint that he's the one who kept all the records. This wouldn't have happened had I not been, and I don't want to take credit that I'm not due to take, had I not been open to someone else coming in and running the project. And by running the project, I mean, he ran the project. He did. He was the project manager who knew more about change than anybody else. It was recommended to me. I sat down and talked with him. I felt we would be very, very compatible. But this was his genius. He doesn't like me to say that, but if I could ask for a show of hands and you would all say, wow, this is genius. Everybody would, who listens to him and sees what he did. And that's a part of leadership, is saying, it's the goal. It's not whether or not I get the credit or whatever. You'll get your credit one way or the other. You'll get it if you want to be a leader. But this really is about getting the right people on the bus, the right people in the right seats, and then bringing everybody together to work toward a common goal. And I didn't even really, so I just brought Jim in every year, and then I began to realize how critical it was to understand leadership, to understand what happened, because this was a monumental event for Tulsa. And then I began to think more in this class about how you lead for change. And this has made it really nice. It's really dovetailed really nice with your other assignment that you have, but by bringing Jim in the very beginning, then you get a chance to see how that blends in with other concepts.
yes,
Out of the dozen or so schools that you talked to, how many of them had brought in outside help versus the superintendent and board doing it on their own?
it was a minority for sure. I'm thinking 3. There was a sense, and most of them were very large. You know, you're talking about Dallas, and you're talking about San Francisco, New York. You're talking about big places with huge staffs. It seemed like about 3, maybe 4 had brought somebody else in. I hadn't really thought about it.
Pittsburgh was one of them that you.
Yeah.
Did you see a correlation between success and having brought someone in?
Well, you raised this first time that I've thought about this. So I'm trying to remember who those were, so I can't tell you what the correlation was, if there was one. I know New York, they did it. I told you, they picked and choose, so they didn't bring one in. Well,
Well, obviously not enough for it to stand out.
yeah, it didn't hit me. Sorry.
Yeah, that's a good observation.
Okay, so just to wrap this up then, the commitment was to find more efficiencies, bring equalities, and therefore be more effective in what the mission of the district is. Ended up closing 14 schools and no high schools. The ultimate decision was that no high school did close. I'm going to show you the recommendation of where high schools were, but that's not the final recommendation. Try to reinvest all of those savings into the classrooms, provide more equity in educational opportunities, so it's even throughout. There's not, and help avoid this transferring from one place to another. And at the same time, I can't overemphasize that it was totally distinct from this effort. There was a teacher and leader effectiveness process that was going through. How to actually measure teachers' performance, how to set standards for those performance reviews, and then how to coach weak spots up to a standard. And that was going on at the same time, and it was a perfect parallel. I mean, it really was a very, from my perspective, a very nice. We had the change in the vision, and that gave a whole new direction for the district. And then we had the teacher and leader effectiveness, which gave a whole emphasis on what difference it makes to have the right teacher in the right classroom. And then we had what we were doing in terms of resources. And just to give you seats eliminated, we had 50,000 seats when we started. We eliminated over 10,000 seats. We eliminated almost 6,000 seats. And that made a dramatic difference in this ability to wake up on a Tuesday and say, I think I'll go to Barnard today. Final recommendation, these schools were closed. We did everything by the high school feeder area. Let's see. And here's the part I like. These are the ideas that came from the Blue Sky Group. Expand the elementary where possible from pre-K to 6. The whole goal here was giving the elementary school students an extra year in that elementary system that was more nurturing. And reconfiguring wherever possible to a 7 through 12. So there's only that one transition from 6 to 7, instead of having a transition from elementary to middle and then another one from middle to high school. The idea was even if you couldn't consolidate buildings 7 through 12, if you associated schools together, you had the same colors and the same mascots and the same, whatever, the whole concept, all from the research that was presented.
That's why we changed all those names.
That's right.
Whitney to Hale Junior High, East Central Junior High, we changed that.
Sure. Recommendation for the increased use of uniforms. A lot of concerns from parents about, my 7th grade daughter going to be in the same building with your 12th grade son, and how's that going to work? And how you could use uniforms in the same school but differentiate them. So if you saw that uniform with that group, then that's a 7th grader. This is
And a couple of years after this, we had the vote to And it was a very contentious time and vote. We had a lot of activity at the board meetings over requiring that everybody in TPS be in uniforms. That turned out Booker T at several board meetings. But those kids were good. They were good in their comments. Eventually, we had a vote that everybody's in uniforms.
Try to utilize the savings to restore art, music, and PE, and trying to, one of the biggest innovations was partnering with TCC so that you could have simultaneous high school graduation and be receiving college credits at the same time. I think we had some great partnerships at the time with OU. I presume that's still going on. I don't know. And then TU, OSU Tulsa, OU Tulsa for urban teaching, and then the Teach for America was just beginning its efforts. So those were all new ideas. So I want to show you one of the things. I think we have time. Okay. Maybe I'll do this. Let's see. Okay. These are the actual proposals. And I'm not going to go through every slide, and I'll make sure you get a copy of this if you want it. And of course, the blues, I should have said one of the other questions you have to ask is, if you ask a creative group, when do you cut them off and say, okay, that's enough creativity and we have to have some kind of reality here. So you'll see some of these teams, they were each assigned to come up with one recommendation. So most of them came up with 2 recommendations. And so here you'll see there are 2 models of configuration that provide only one transition. One model would be elementary, pre-K through 6, and then the other 7 through 12, and the other configuration would be pre-K through 8, and then 9 through 12. And both of these models are presented in this proposal, of course. So, let's see how to go there. Here we go. The trade-up components, we talked a lot about that. I guess I didn't mention it. But the whole idea was, when all was said and done, every student should be trading up in some aspect of their education. And that was part of the assignment that the Blue Sky group had. They had to be able to show what are this new configuration that you have, what are the trade-ups that these students enjoy. Efficiency rating of at least 80%. Capacity, so that there's your capacity, 80%. They had an exception for Webster, Edison, Memorial, Hale, and East Central. And this group recommended 17 schools for closing. Then they would lay out the feeder pattern. Everyone had to justify the position that they were taking. So this is part of their justification. I'm not going to read through it. Webster Technology and Broadcast Journalism feeder wanted to make sure that every school, every high school would continue to offer something special, and that would be its own special magnet. Okay, this was PK through 5. I just am showing you this because I want you to see the effort that these people went through. And this is the ultimate document that they came up with. These are all the additional classes and services that they would have. And then it goes through each of the feeder patterns. Let's see, I thought they had a summary at the end. Continuous learning calendar. Intersessions, they had a lot of interesting ideas. Community focused. tutoring, out-of-school time activities, Saturday schools, summer schools, micro-society, P20 concept that, preschool through college, community service, college credits, early care and learning. Yeah, I guess I thought this one doesn't have a summary page. Apologize for that. Yes. That was blue. I think it's red. Now they call themselves the Red Hot Team. They talk about trading up. Okay, their proposal was pre-K through K centers 1 through 8 and 9 through 12. Full health and nursing and social services support, library access, standardized arts, technology, and language. All the trade-ups. These are all their trade-ups. PE. More electives, really evening out the electives. Let's see, each of these going through. See, they closed 1 or 2 in every configuration. They closed 17 elementary, 1 middle, and 2 high schools. This group recommended closing Hale and then either Webster or Central. This was the only group that came out that strongly. They well understood the difficulty in closing the high school, but the numbers were so small, they felt it was justified to do it. Then redraw the zones. This is all the research. They're citing their sources here. Okay. And then the last one was the yellow team. And I will tell you that what was approved is not exactly any one of these 3, because after these 3 were rolled out and there was all this discussion, there were still a couple of tweaks that were made based on the comments. Okay. Webster Banner closing both Park and Adams. Webster becomes 7 through 12. Eugene Fields, Robertson, and Remington become PK through 4. Clinton becomes 5 and 6. And then Webster. Okay. This is closing Burroughs Academy, Roosevelt, Anderson, and as well as Madison. Going PK through 4, and then a 5-6 center, and then 7-12. That's the philosophy that this group had. McLean, closing 5. Closing 2 in the Rogers pattern. No, 4. East Central, closing Sandburg only. Hale, no closure there. Memorial closing Nimitz and Grimes, but then they were both reutilized. Closing Barnard and Phillips in the Edison pattern. These are the magnet schools and the early childhood, and then they made a big push for increasing the enrollment in both Mayo and Thoreau, and combining the alternate education programming.
And you saw a lot of those surface, and I know we're getting deep in the proposal, we're about to finish, but just want to make this point. We did pick up on that, Thoreau being very popular, Mayo being very popular. So what happened? We ended up closing Wilson. We ended up putting in Will Rogers. Wilson was open, so we ended up moving Mayo. So we increased the enrollment of Mayo by half again as much. We were able to do that. And you saw up there that Fulton's was bought, and when Fulton was bought, that gave us enough money to go in and really do some nice renovation on Wilson. We ended up going to a district-wide enrollment center, which is where Eisenhower used to be. But these are some things that came out of all of that discussion. And one was, there are not enough opportunities for kids to take language immersion. There just aren't. And so that's why we started the dual language immersion program in Monroe. Now think about it, Monroe, right there, a couple blocks off of 46th and Lewis in North Tulsa, had been closed for years, and was one of the things we really heard whenever we went out and had our community hearings. We ended up opening up Monroe based on the same premise as Thoreau. In fact, we call it Monroe demonstration. Exactly the same basics that we had at Thoreau. And it continues to grow. It's not where Thoreau is yet, but it's there. And the dual language grew so much that we went and opened up ECDC Bunch. And whenever you start selling buildings, you have, like, we had $1.5 million that we could invest in ECDC Bunch. And now if you go take a look at it, it's the dual language center. Or, it's enough. It's added to it. We closed Nimitz. Then we came back, and some of the money we had from Fulton, we also used on Nimitz, and we made Nimitz beautiful, and we increased Eisenhower by half again as much. We also increased Zero. Some of you aren't familiar with Tulsa Public, so I'm going through all of these, but there were a lot of repercussions, from going through this. Jim, I'll let you.
Well, I usually save a few minutes at the end just to, get your thoughts, and if you have questions, I will email Dr. Ballard the presentation. I will say that it was a privilege to work with this group. As I say, I've worked in the corporate world for my entire career, and when Sitco moved to Houston, I decided to stay, just retire and stay. And it's the first time I had ever worked, certainly in academia. And it was a tremendous learning experience for me. And I hope that I was able to pass on some learning, not about academia obviously, but some learning on process to the group that was there at TES. And I guess I just want to say, change is hard work. I liken it to digging a ditch, except this one we dug for about 9 months, and it gets old. And this all looks, as Dr. Ballard said, this all looks like, oh yeah, how hard could that be? And it all comes together in slides. It is hard work, and people lose faith, and they tire, and sometimes they get very discouraged. And you have to keep dragging that piano up the stairs to make everybody believe that it can happen. I used to teach a class actually at Sitco about change management, and I said, all you have to do is remember it's like Tinkerbell. If you don't believe, it won't fly. And if you do believe, it will fly. You've got to have faith in what you're doing, and to me that's the hallmark of great leadership, is really having faith in what you're doing, not that you know everything, full well understanding you don't know everything, but having faith in what you're doing, and that just helps you put one foot in front of the others. That's, to me, what leadership is, putting one foot in front of the other.
Do any of you have any questions or time where we need to take a break? But I want to give you the opportunity while he is here. So,
just by reviewing all of this and taking all of this in, I wasn't really aware of this project, but it seems to me like looking, on the outside, looking in, there's a huge amount of trust that you put forth in this effort, and so did you. My question is, after it was all said and done, how did this impact morale of the school and the community as a whole? What was the climate after it was said and done?
well, a part of that answer, and I alluded to this, and I say this with total humility, but I was sitting in my office the other day, and and I have a copy of the magazine. In 2012, I was named Tulsa of the Year. And on the front cover of the Tulsa People magazine, they said he restored faith in the school system. So some people thought that by being that open and that aggressive that we restored faith in the public school system. I'm not going to pretend that there weren't people who, did not approve of what we did. Just recently, one of the new school board members, I don't even know her, said, well, there's still some people that have a sour taste in their mouth over Project Schoolhouse. And she was referring to the area of North Tulsa that she represents. The only area that grew under Project Schoolhouse was North Tulsa. North Tulsa emerged with the demonstration school. They emerged with the new dual language program, and they emerged with the separate 7th grade center, the only one that we have in the city. That's not true. That anything would have happened that should have left someone with a sour taste in their mouth. But that goes with leadership, and that's the way it goes. So on one hand, I, because I'm superintendent, was judged on this, and I think you will find a mixed bag. I think overall, I believe that it showed people that we were willing to take on our problems. You looked at all of the data. We had to do something. We had to do something. And I've heard politicians say that they felt differently about PPS after we went through that they felt like we really were trying to economize and make our district better. Overall, I believe that people felt good about Project Schoolhouse whenever it was finished, and I think a lot of it was the process that we went through. Nobody can say that they didn't have an opportunity. Nobody. If they do, they're just flat wrong. I mean, I started this whole process by going because he told me to. I went to every single high school, wide open, and we started with, all they knew were the rumors. We're going to have
There were plenty of rumors.
school closing kind of a thing, and Jim said, we're going to go to every single high school. The first one I went to was East Central. And, here they came. And you got mixed reaction. Some people came in and said, you're not going to close, you're not, But everybody had their say. It was wide open. And I stood there. I walked into Mayo, not Mayo, Thoreau. There were 350 people in Thoreau that night. And when I left, after about 3 hours, I remember calling my wife, and she said, how'd it go? And I said, went good. Good. And she said, well, tell me about it. And so I told her some of the stuff that was said. And it actually ended up very positive. And so after I told her all of that, she said to me, what exactly was it about this that you thought went good?
It's good.
That's exactly what she said.
Because I called my wife and she said, how'd it go? And I said, it's over.
Yeah. And my answer was, I got my answer. She said, what do you mean by that? I said, I got my answer. I went out there and I saw how strongly those folks believe there's no way I'm going to sell Thoreau and move that to Wilson, which at the time I thought was really a pretty good idea. That's a good idea. That's a part of what leadership is. Look, what I do in my class, and you're going to have me a couple of times, is I present situations and I bring in people to talk to you and I talk about it. Then it's up to you to think it through. How does that apply to me in Stillwell? How does that apply to me when I'm really trying to make some changes there? And I leave it up to you to analyze that and to think that through. And you're going to do a paper on leading through change. And I hope your paper on leading through change is very influenced by this and by other things that we talk about, so that when you do that, you think it through. It's not that you read some article and now you think you know about change. You don't know about change until you live through something like this. That's probably too lengthy of an answer. I think Tulsa emerged from this feeling good about it. We'd already passed a bond issue in 2010, $354 million, and we got 77% yes, which people said that was a remarkably high percentage. We did one more in 2015, Tulsa, Oklahoma, $415 million, by far the largest bond issue ever in the history of the state of Oklahoma, and it got 85.5% yes. So if people don't believe in the city, if they don't believe in what you're doing, you're not going to get 85.5% of the people to vote yes on a $450 million bond issue in Tulsa, Oklahoma. You're just not. So yeah, people felt good about it. I knew that at the time. I knew that people felt good about it whenever we went That was a good question. Any other questions of me? Or
I
of
just
Mr.
had a
McCarthy?
question about kind of the three proposal concept, because the final one did look different from really all three.
All three.
And,
It closer resembled one of them, but you're
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
We took parts, yeah.
and you know, whether that feedback, then did you take that back to the advisory council?
yes.
Or, and that's, so it kind of started all over
Always
again?
true to the system.
The
gotta-
system just stayed
Right.
the same?
We said we
Otherwise-
would never take anything to the board that the advisory council did not approve of.
Right.
So we had to take everything back through the advisory council. Every time, everything.
And did it ruffle the feathers of any of the blue sky people that maybe one of their things didn't then get? Like, did you hear about that when the
I got
final
some
proposal
feedback.
was?
I did get some. I got an email from a couple people. One saying that there'll be no more donuts. They were all so proud of what they had done, and they didn't feel. Although they entered it like a competition, and they presented to one another, and you might have seen on one of those where the group that went last, I think was the yellow group or something, and they said, "Why ours is better than blue? Why ours is better than red?" And they were very competitive, but they truly believed in what they had done, and they were just different enough that they all felt good about them. And I think, quite honestly, I think the fact that not one of them was chosen exactly as presented helped a little bit. But I think if you contacted any of them today, they'd still tell you, "Oh, ours was better."
I think we brought people on board, politicians and others who've been really skeptical of Tulsa Public Schools. That's just this huge place where nobody ever really took a look at it and tried to economize and tried to make it different. I had a couple of really surprising contacts when it was over from people that had not been supportive at all and felt like that we at least tried to do the right thing. But we also had our detractors. That goes with the territory. Any
Yeah, I
other
think-
questions of Mr. McCarthy? Go ahead.
I was just curious about the magnet schools, Booker T and Edison, and then if any of the proposals had said that they should be no longer a magnet school, if they would just go as a straight high school.
There were no proposals that said that the magnet concept should be eliminated. I think instead there were proposals that included this high school should have more investment. It was, I think I showed you on Webster. Should have more investment in broadcasting and to try to elevate the level of the if you will, non-magnet.
We expanded by one magnet schools. We changed. Will Rogers was no longer a boundary school. Will Rogers went to a magnet school from that. So we did expand to a magnet. But what I really liked is we took that idea about making them a college high program, and that was where we really met a lot of controversy. I don't know why I laughed about that, because I went through some tough times. That's where we met a lot of controversy, because we said that the 11th and 12th grades had to leave. You probably remember that if you were around. We cleared those out and we sent them other places. And then we grew Rogers into it. And the facts are indisputably there that Rogers has benefited from that program. And we made it into a magnet program. And it really is, they really have done much better under the new one. So now magnets are pretty popular.
I wanted to point something out on the yellow, the last one you showed,
Yes.
and you kind of just went through it, but you pointed a couple things out. Two of which I kind of picked up on, which one was the closure of Park and the expansion of Webster into a 7 through 12.
I
And if you
caught
look
that as
at
well.
what happened with
Yes.
the consolidation this
Exactly.
year,
Yeah.
those two things both happened.
Yeah, that's a good catch there. I saw that as well. I don't think they probably, I don't know. I mean, I have a great relationship with Deborah, and I talk to her when she feels like talking, or I want to make contact with her. And we did talk some about that. I did not say that came from Schoolhouse.
Well, no, but I just thought it was interesting that they
Yeah.
happened to propose it that long ago, and then the reality this year turned into
Yeah,
something.
I think it's that there was a kind of a philosophy that grew out of Schoolhouse, and I think they followed it. I mean, you still had people on the school board who were certainly there and had to take a vote on Schoolhouse, and I think probably there was some of that influence. Probably some of that influence came from Gary Personal, who was very instrumental in board support for Schoolhouse, and he can be very critical and asks very tough questions. And he represented that area, and yet he was there. I think in the final analysis, I believe that he had a no vote on that. Not totally sure, but, and I don't know this for a fact, but things like that can be that's long-term in the best interest if you know something's going to pass, and board members kind of know that. Being a board member in an urban setting is very difficult. Other questions for Jim or other comments? We're 5 minutes past what I had allotted for this, and everybody needs a break, but I want to make sure before he leaves, you can question me about it, but before he leaves, that you question him about it. I said this at the outset, and I will say this, we would not have done what we did. I thought your question was insightful about, bringing in someone outside, and had other places done that. I think as a leader, I hadn't heard of it, I hadn't thought of it, but when it was presented to me, I knew how busy I was. And I knew that I could not do that justice, I could not get that done. And it didn't take me very long looking at his resume and what he had done, and the suggestion was made to me by the philanthropic group. And then, of course, you sit down and talk, but I knew instantly that there was a compatibility with Jim and I. And make no mistake about it, and I've already made this clear, he ran the program. He ran the program. He met with me regularly, but that was his full-time job, and he wasn't there as a smart lawyer. He was there to run it because he had a lot of experience. We didn't even talk about sit-go and some of the other things that he did. He's had a lot of experience in change management. So it really is about getting the right people and then making sure that you have them in the right place on the bus. And as a leader, you have to entrust folks. And of course, that's to scale. Jerry's not going to deal with that at Riverside on that scale. Randy's not going to deal with that at Wagner. But it all applies. The application is there, and you can definitely make it. So I just again want to thank my friend Jim McCarthy.
I always end with this statement that change is inevitable except from a vending machines.
Take a break, come back in about 10 or 15 minutes or whatever.